Our great national park, the Valley of the Yellowstone. The Yellowstone River, one of the tributaries of the Missouri, has a long, devious flow of 1,300 miles ere it loses its waters in those of the larger stream. Its source is a noble lake situated in Wyoming Territory and nestled amid the snow peaks of the highest mountain range in the country. The upper course of the river is through immense canyons and gorges, and its flow is often marked by splendid waterfalls and rapids, presenting at various points some of the most remarkable scenery in the country. The entire region about its source is volcanic, and abounds in boiling springs, mud volcanoes, soda springs, sulfur mountains, and geysers the marvel of which outdo those of Iceland. This remarkable area has recently been set apart by Congress for a great national park. It certainly possesses striking characteristics for the purpose to which it has been devoted, exhibiting the grand and magnificent in its snow-capped mountains and dark canyons, the picturesque in its splendid waterfalls and strangely formed rocks, the beautiful in the sylvan shores of its noble lake, and the phenomenal in its geysers, hot springs, and mountains of sulfur. It may be claimed that in no other portion of the globe are there united so many surprising features, none where the conditions of beauty and contrast are so calculated to delight the artist, or where the phenomena are so abundant for the entertainment and instruction of the student. It is a magnificent domain in its proportions, extending nearly 65 miles from north to south and 55 miles from east to west. The Yellowstone Lake lies near the southeasterly corner of the park, the Yellowstone River flowing from its upper boundary and running almost due north. The lake is 22 miles in length, and its average width from 10 to 15 miles. Its height above the level of the sea is 7,000 feet, while its basin is surrounded by mountains reaching an altitude of over 10,000 feet, the peaks of which are covered with perpetual snow. Numerous hot springs are found on the shores of the lake, and also along the banks of the river. About 15 miles from its source, the river takes two distinct precipitous leaps, known as the Upper and the Lower Falls, and beyond the falls cuts its way through an immense canyon, the vertical walls of which reach, at places, the height of 1,500 feet. Near the western boundary of the park, the Madison, an important tributary of the Columbia, takes its rise, and along one of the branches of this river, known as Fire Hole River, are found numerous extraordinary geysers, some of which throw volumes of boiling water to a height exceeding 200 feet. In the northwest corner of the park, the Gallatin, another tributary of the Columbia, takes its rise. This wonderland has only recently been explored. For years, marvelous stories have been rife among the hunters of the far west of a mysterious country in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, which the Indians avoided as the abode of the evil spirits, where the rumble of the earthquake is frequently heard, where great jets of steam burst through the earth, where volcanoes throw up mud instead of fire, and where the river flows through gorges of savage grandeur. But beyond these rumors, often apparently absurd exaggerations, nothing was known of that region. An exploring party under Captain Reynolds of the United States Engineer Corps endeavored to enter the Yellowstone Basin in 1859 by way of the Wind River Mountains at the south, but failed on account of the ruggedness of the mountains and the depth of the snow. In 1870, an exploring party under General Washburn, escorted by Lieutenant Doane of the United States Army, succeeded in entering the valley, and from this source the public obtained the first trustworthy accounts of the strange land. Immediately thereafter, an expedition under sanction of Congress was organized by the Secretary of the Interior and placed in the charge of Professor F.V. Hayden, United States geologist, while at the same time a party under the command of Lieutenant Barlow of the United States Engineer Corps ascended the Yellowstone and traversed the greater part of the area now included in the park. Professor Hayden's expedition made a thorough exploration of the whole region, and it is to his full and exhaustive report to Congress that we are indebted for an accurate, detailed knowledge of the strange features of this remarkable land. It is to this gentleman, probably more than any other person, that we are indebted for the idea of converting the valley into a national park. The expedition, however, was organized by the Honorable Columbus Delano, Secretary of the Interior, and hence we may attribute the successful issue of the noble conception to the cooperation of the Secretary with the purposes of the scientific explorers appointed by him. From the interesting pages of Professor Hayden's report, we mainly draw the subjoined particulars of the romantic wonders of our imperial pleasure ground, the Yellowstone Basin. The Yellowstone Basin proper, in which the greater portion of the interesting scenery and wonders is located, comprises only that portion enclosed within the remarkable ranges of mountains which give origin to the waters of the Yellowstone south of Mount Washburn and the Grand Canyon. The range of which Mount Washburn is a conspicuous peak seems to form the north wall or rim extending nearly east and west across the Yellowstone, and it is through this portion of the rim that the river has cut its channel, forming the remarkable falls and still more wonderful canyon. The area of this basin is about 40 miles in length. From the summit of Mount Washburn, a bird's-eye view of the entire basin may be obtained, with the mountains surrounding it on every side, without any apparent break in the rim. This basin has been called, by some travelers, the vast crater of an ancient volcano. It is probable that during the Pliocene period, the entire country, drained by the sources of the Yellowstone and the Columbia, was the scene of as great volcanic activity as that of any portion of the globe. It might be called one vast crater, made up of thousands of small volcanic vents and fissures, out of which the fluid interior of the earth, fragments of rock, and volcanic dust were poured in unlimited quantities. Hundreds of the nuclei, or cores of these volcanic vents, are now remaining, some of them rising to a height of 10,000 to 11,000 feet above the sea. Mounts Doane, Langford, Stevenson, and more than 100 other peaks may be seen from any high point on either side of the basin, each of which formed a center of effusion. Indeed, the hot springs and geysers of this region at the present time are nothing more than the closing stages of that wonderful period of volcanic action that began in tertiary times. In other words, they are the escape pipes or vents for those internal forces which once were so active but are now continually dying out. The evidence is clear that, ever since the cessation of the more powerful volcanic forces, these springs have acted as the escape pipes but have continued to decline down to the present time, and will do so in the future until they cease entirely. The Falls and the Grand Canyon. But the objects of the deepest interest in this region are the Falls and the Grand Canyon. I will attempt to convey some idea by a description, but it is only through the eye that the mind can gather anything like an adequate conception of them. As we approached the margin of the canyon, we could hear the suppressed roar of the falls resembling distant thunder. The two falls are not more than 1/4 of a mile apart. Above the upper falls, the Yellowstone flows through a grassy, meadow-like valley with a calm, steady current giving no warning until very near the falls that it is about to rush over a precipice 140 feet and then, within 1/4 of a mile, again to leap down a distance of 350 feet. But no language can do justice to the wonderful grandeur and beauty of the canyon below the falls. The very nearly vertical walls slightly sloping down to the water's edge on either side, so that from the summit the river appears like a thread of silver foaming over its rocky bottom. The variegated colors of the sides, yellow, red, brown, white, all intermixed and shading into each other. The Gothic columns of every form standing out from the sides of the walls with great variety and more striking colors than ever adorned a work of human art. The margins of the canyon on either side are beautifully fringed with pines. In some places, the walls of the canyon are composed of massive basalt, so separated by the jointage as to look like irregular mason work going to decay. Here and there, a depression in the surface of the basalt has been subsequently filled up by the more modern deposit, and the horizontal strata of sandstone can be seen. The decomposition of the colors of the rocks must have been due largely to hot water from the springs, which has percolated all through, giving to them the present variegated and unique appearance. Standing near the margin of the lower falls, and looking down the canyon, which looks like an immense chasm or cleft in the basalt, with its sides 1,200 to 1,500 feet high and decorated with the most brilliant colors that the human eye ever saw, with the rocks weathered into an almost unlimited variety of forms, with here and there a pine sending its roots into the clefts on the sides as if struggling with a sort of uncertain success to maintain an existence. The whole presents a picture that it would be difficult to surpass in nature. Mr. Thomas Moran, a celebrated artist and noted for his skill as a colorist, exclaimed with a kind of regretful enthusiasm that these beautiful tints were beyond the reach of human art. It is not the depth alone that gives such an impression of grandeur to the mind, but it is also the picturesque forms and coloring. After the waters of the Yellowstone roll over the upper descent, they flow with great rapidity over the apparently flat, rocky bottom, which spreads out to nearly double its width above the falls, and continues thus until near the lower falls, when the channel again contracts, and the waters seem, as it were, to gather themselves into one compact mass and plunge over the descent of 350 feet in detached drops of foam as white as snow. Some of the large globules of water shoot down like the contents of an exploded rocket. It is a sight far more beautiful than, though not so grand or impressive as, that of Niagara Falls. A heavy mist always rises from the water at the foot of the falls, so dense that one cannot approach within 200 or 300 feet, and even then the clothes will be drenched in a few moments. Upon the yellow, nearly vertical walls of the west side, the mist mostly falls, and for 300 feet from the bottom, the wall is covered with a thick matting of mosses, sedges, grasses, and other vegetation of the most vivid green, which have sent their small roots into the softened rocks and are nourished by the ever-ascending spray. At the base, and quite high up on the sides of the canyon, are great quantities of talus, and through the fragments of rocks and decomposing spring deposits may be seen the horizontal strata of breccia. Tower Creek. Tower Creek rises in the high divide between the valleys of the Missouri and Yellowstone and flows about 10 miles through a canyon so deep and gloomy that it has very properly earned the appellation of the Devil's Den. As we gaze from the margin down into the depths below, the little stream, as it rushes foaming over the rocks, seems like a white thread, while on the sides of the gorge the somber pinnacles rise up like Gothic spires. About 200 yards above its entrance into the Yellowstone, the stream pours over an abrupt descent of 156 feet, forming one of the most beautiful and picturesque falls to be found in any country. The Tower Falls are about 260 feet above the level of the Yellowstone at the junction, and they are surrounded with pinnacle-like columns composed of the volcanic breccia, rising 50 feet above the falls and extending down to the foot, standing like gloomy sentinels, or like the gigantic pillars at the entrance of some grand temple. One could almost imagine that the idea of the Gothic style of architecture had been caught from such carvings of nature. Immense boulders of basalt and granite here obstruct the flow of the stream above and below the falls. And, although so far as we can see, the gorge seems to be made up of the volcanic cement, yet we know that, in the loftier mountains near the source of the stream, true granitic as well as igneous rocks prevail. Yellowstone Lake. On the 28th of July, 1871, says Professor Hayden, we arrived at the lake and pitched our camp on the northwest shore in a beautiful grassy meadow, or opening among the dense pines. The lake lay before us, a vast sheet of quiet water of the most delicate ultramarine hue, one of the most beautiful scenes I have ever beheld. The entire party were filled with enthusiasm. The great object of all our labors had been reached, and we were amply paid for all our toils. Such a vision is worth a lifetime, and only one of such marvelous beauty will ever greet human eyes. From whatever point of view one may behold it, it presents a unique picture. We had brought up the framework of a boat, 12 feet long and 3.5 feet wide, which we covered with stout ducking, well tarred. On the morning of the 29th, Messrs. Stevenson and Elliott started across the lake in the Anna, the first boat ever launched on the Yellowstone, and explored the nearest island, which we named after the principal assistant of the expedition, who was undoubtedly the first white man that had ever placed foot upon it. Our little bark, whose keel was the first to plow the waters of the most beautiful lake of our continent, and which must now become historical, was named by Mr. Stevenson in compliment to Miss Anna L. Dawes, the amiable daughter of Honorable H. L. Dawes. My whole party were glad to manifest by this slight tribute their gratitude to the distinguished statesman whose generous sympathy and aid had contributed so much towards securing the appropriation which enabled them to explore this marvelous region. Usually in the morning, the surface of the lake is calm, but toward noon and after, the waves commence to roll and the white caps rise high, sometimes 4 or 5 feet. Our little boat rode the waves well, but when a strong breeze blew, the swell was too great and we could only venture along the shore. This lake is about 22 miles in length from north to south, and an average of 10 to 15 miles in width from east to west. It has been aptly compared to the human hand. The northern portion would constitute the palm, while the southern prolongations or arms might represent the fingers. There are some of the most beautiful shorelines along this lake that I ever saw. Some of the curves are as perfect as if drawn by the human hand of art. Our little boat performed most excellent service. A suitable framework was fastened in the stern for the lead and line, and with the boat, a system of soundings was made that gave a very fair idea of the average depth of the lake. The greatest depth discovered was 300 feet. It is fed by the snows that fall upon the lofty ranges of mountains that surround it on every side. The water of the lake has, at all seasons, nearly the temperature of cold spring water. The most accomplished swimmer could live but a short time in it. The dangers attending the navigation of such a lake in a small boat are thereby greatly increased. The lake abounds in small trout, and it is visited by great numbers of wild fowl. We adopted the plan of making permanent camps at different points around the lake while explorations of the country in the vicinity were made. Our second camp was pitched at the hot springs on the southwest arm. This position commanded one of the finest views of the lake and its surroundings. While the air was still, scarcely a ripple could be seen on the surface, and varied hues from the most vivid green shading to ultramarine presented a picture that would have stirred the enthusiasm of the most fastidious artist. Sometimes, in the latter portion of the day, a strong wind would arise, arousing this calm surface into waves like the sea. Near our camp, there is a thick deposit of silica, which has been worn by the waves into a bluff wall 25 feet high above the water. It must have originally extended far out into the lake. The belt of springs at this place is about 3 miles long and 1/2 mile wide. The deposit now can be seen far out in the deeper portions of the lake, and the bubbles that arise to the surface in various places indicate the presence at the orifice of a hot springs beneath. Some of the funnel-shaped craters extend out so far into the lake that the members of our party stood upon the silicious mound, extending the rod into the deeper waters, and caught the trout and cooked them in the boiling springs without removing them from the hook. These orifices or chimneys have no connection with the waters of the lake. The hot fumes coming up through fissures extend down toward the interior of the earth, are confined within the walls of the orifice, which are mostly circular and beautifully lined with delicate porcelain. The Hot Springs. Upon the west side of Gardiner's River, on the slope of the mountain, is one of the most remarkable groups of hot springs in the world. The springs in action at the present time are not very numerous, or even so wonderful as some of those higher up in the Yellowstone Valley or in the Firehole Basin, but it is in the remains that we find so instructive records of their past history. The calcareous deposits from these springs cover an area of about 2 miles square. The active springs extend from the margin of the river 5,545 feet to an elevation nearly 1,000 above, or 6,522 feet above the sea by barometrical measurement. Our path led up the hill by the side of a wall of lower Cretaceous rocks, and we soon came to the most abundant remains of old springs which, in past times, must have been very active. The steep hill, for nearly a mile, is covered with a thick crust, and, though much decomposed and covered with a moderately thick growth of pines and cedar, still bore traces of the same wonderful architectural beauty displayed in the vicinities of the active springs farther up the hill. After ascending the side of the mountain, about a mile above the channel of Gardiner's River, we suddenly came in full view of one of the finest displays of nature's architectural skill the world can produce. The snowy whiteness of the deposit at once suggested the name of White Mountain Hot Springs. It had the appearance of a frozen cascade. If a group of springs near the summit of the mountain were to distribute their waters down the irregular declivities and they were slowly congealed, the picture would bear some resemblance in form. We pitched our camp at the foot of the principal mountain, by the side of the stream that contained the aggregated waters of the hot springs above, which, by the time they had reached our camp, were sufficiently cooled for our use. Before us was a hill 200 feet high, composed of the calcareous deposits of the hot springs, with a system of step-like terraces which would defy any description by words. The eye alone could convey any adequate conception of the mind. The steep sides of the hill were ornamented with a series of semicircular basins with margins varying in height from a few inches to 6 or 8 feet, and so beautifully scalloped and adorned with a kind of beadwork that the beholder stands amazed at this marvel of nature's handiwork. Add to this a snow-white ground with every variety of shade of scarlet, green, and yellow as brilliant as the brightest of our aniline dyes. The pools or basins are of all sizes, from a few inches to 6 or 8 feet in diameter, and from 2 inches to 2 feet deep. As the water flows from the spring over the mountainside from one basin to another, it loses continually a portion of its heat, and the bather can find any desirable temperature. At the top of the hill, there is a broad, flat terrace, covered more or less with these basins, 150 to 200 yards in diameter, and many of them going to decay. Here we find the largest, finest, and most active spring of the group at the present time. The largest spring is very near the outer margin of the terrace, and is 25 by 40 feet in diameter, the water so perfectly transparent that one can look down in the beautiful ultramarine depths to the bottom of the basin. The sides of the basin are ornamented with coral-like forms, with a great variety of shades from pure white to bright cream yellow, and the blue sky, reflected in the transparent waters, gives an azure tint to the whole which surpasses all art. Underneath the sides of many of these pools are rows of stalactites of all sizes, many of them exquisitely ornamented, formed by the dripping of the water over the margin of the basins. On the west side of this deposit, about 1/3 of the way up the White Mountain from the river and terrace, which was once the theater of many active springs, old chimneys, or craters, are scattered thickly over the surface, and there are several large holes and fissures leading to vast caverns beneath the crust. The crust gives off a dull, hollow sound beneath the tread, and the surface gives distinct evidence of having been adorned with the beautiful pools or basins just described. As we pass up the basin of the principal terrace, we find a large area covered with shallow pools, some of them containing water, with all of the ornamentation perfect, while others are fast going to decay, and the decomposed sediment is as white as snow. Upon this kind of sub-terrace is a remarkable cone, about 50 feet in height and 25 feet in diameter at the base. From its form, we give it the name of the Liberty Cap. It is undoubtedly the remains of an extinct geyser. The water was forced up with considerable power and probably without intermission, building up its own crater until the pressure beneath was exhausted, and then it gradually closed itself over at the summit and perished. No water flows from it at the present time. The layers of lime were deposited around it like the layers of straw on a thatched roof or hay on a conical stack. The entire Yellowstone Basin is covered more or less with dead and dying springs, but there are centers or groups where the activity is greatest at the present time. Below the falls, there is an extensive area covered with the deposits which extend from the south side of Mount Washburn across the Yellowstone Rim, covering an area of 10 or 15 square miles. On the south side of Mount Washburn, there is quite a remarkable group of active springs. They are evidently diminishing in power, but the rims all around reveal the most powerful manifestations far back in the past. Sulfur, copper, alum, and soda cover the surface. There is also, precipitated around the borders of some of the mud springs, a white efflorescence, probably nitrate of potash. These springs are located on the side of the mountain, nearly 1,000 feet above the margin of the canyon, but extend along into the level portions below. In the immediate channel of the river, at the present time, there are very few springs, and these not important. A few small steam vents can be observed only from the issue of small quantities of steam. One of these springs was bubbling quite briskly, but had a temperature of only 100 degrees. Extending across the canyon, on the opposite side of the Yellowstone, interrupted here and there, this group of springs extends for several miles, forming one of the largest deposits of silica, but only here and there are there signs of life. Many of the dead springs are mere basins with a thick deposit of iron on the sides, lining the channel of the water that flows through them. These vary in temperature from 98 to 120 degrees. The highest temperature was 192 degrees. The steam vents are very numerous, and the chimneys are lined with sulfur. Where the crust can be removed, we find the underside lined with the most delicate crystals of sulfur, which disappear like frostwork at the touch. Still, there is a considerable amount of solid amorphous sulfur. The sulfur and the iron, with the vegetable matter, which is always very abundant about the springs, give, through the almost infinite variety of shades, a most pleasing and striking picture. Mud Springs. We pitched our camp on the shore of the river near the Mud Springs, 13.5 miles above our camp on Cascade Creek. The springs are scattered along on both sides of the river, sometimes extending upon the hillsides 50 to 200 feet above the level of the river. Commencing with the lower or southern side of the group, I will attempt to describe a few of them. The first one is a remarkable mud spring, with a well-defined circular rim composed of fine clay, and raised about 4 feet above the surface around, and about 6 feet above the mud in the basin. The diameter of the basin is about 8 feet. The mud is so fine as to be impalpable, and the whole may be most aptly compared to a cauldron of boiling mush. The gas is constantly escaping, throwing up the mud from a few inches to 6 feet in height, and there is no doubt that there are times when it is hurled out 10 to 20 feet, accumulating around the rim of the basin. About 20 yards distant from the mud spring just described is a second one with a basin nearly circular, 40 feet in diameter, the water 6 or 8 feet below the margin of the rim. The water is quite turbid and is boiling moderately. Small springs are flowing into it from the south side, so that the basin forms a sort of reservoir. The temperature in some portions of the basin is thus lowered to 98 degrees. Several small hot springs pour their surplus water into it, the temperature of which are 180, 170, 184, and 155 degrees. In the reservoirs, where the water boils up with considerable force, the temperature is only 96 degrees, showing that the bubbling was due to the escape of gas. The bubbles stand all over the surface. About 20 feet from the last is a small mud spring with an orifice 10 inches in diameter with whitish-brown mud, 182 degrees. Another basin near the last has 2 orifices, the one throwing out the mud with a dull thud about once in 3 seconds, spurting the mud out 3 or 4 feet. The other is content to boil up quite violently, occasionally throwing the mud 10 to 12 inches. This mud, which has been wrought in these cauldrons for perhaps hundreds of years, is so fine and pure that the manufacturer of porcelain ware would go into ecstasy at the sight. The contents of many of the springs are of such a snowy whiteness that, when dried in cakes in the sun or by a fire, they resemble the finest meerschaum. The color of the mud depends upon the superficial deposits which cover the ground through which the waters of the spring reach the surface. They were all clear hot springs originally, perhaps geysers even, but the continual caving in of the sides has produced a sort of mud pot, exactly the same as the process for preparing a kettle of mush. The water is at first clear and hot, then it becomes turbid from mingling with the loose earth around the sides of the orifice, until, by continued cessation of earth, the contents of the basin become the consistency of thick mush, and as the gas bursts up through it, the dull thud-like noise is produced. Every possible variation of condition of the contents is found, from simple milky turbidness to a stiff mortar. On the east side of the Yellowstone, close to the margin of the river, are a few turbid and mud springs strongly impregnated with alum. The mud is quite yellow and contains much sulfur. This we called a mud-sulfur spring. The basin is 15 by 30 feet and has 3 centers of ebullition, showing that deep down underneath the superficial earth there are 3 separate orifices not connected with each other for the emission of heated waters. Sulphur Mountain and Mud Volcano. From Lieutenant Barlow's report, we derive the following description of a sulphur mountain near Cascade Creek and of a mud volcano a few miles distant. Toward the western verge of a prairie of several miles in extent, above the Yellowstone Falls, a hill of white rock was discovered, which, upon investigation, proved to be another of the Soda Mountains, as they are called by the hunters. Approaching nearer, I found jets of smoke and steam issuing from the face of the hill, while its other side was hollowed out into a sort of amphitheater, whose sides were steaming with sulphur fumes, and ground hot and parched with internal fires. Acre after acre of this hot volcanic surface lay before me, having numerous cracks and small apertures at intervals of a few feet, whence were expelled sometimes in steady continuous streams, sometimes in puffs, like those from an engine, jets of vapor more or less impregnated with mineral substances. I ascended the hill, leaving my horse below, fearful that he might break through the thin rock crust, which in many places gave way beneath the tread, revealing caverns of pure crystallized sulfur from which hot fumes were sure to issue. The crystals were very fine, but too frail to transport without the greatest care. A large boiling spring, emitting strong fumes of sulfur and sulfuretted hydrogen, not at all agreeable, was also found. The water from this spring, overrunning its basin, trickled down the hillside, leaving a high-colored trace in the chalky rock. Upon the opposite side was found a number of larger springs. One, from its size and the power it displayed in throwing water to the height of several feet above the surface, was worthy of notice. Near this was a spring having regular pulsations, like a steam engine, giving off large quantities of steam, which would issue forth with the roar of a hurricane. This was, in reality, a steam volcano. Deep vibrations in the subterraneous caverns, extending far away beneath the hill, could be distinctly heard. The country from this point to the mud volcano, a few miles above, was mostly rolling prairie, intersected with several streams flowing into the river, some of them having wide estuaries and adjacent swampy flats covered with thick marsh grass. Ducks were usually found in these sluggish streams, as well as in the little lakes so numerous throughout this whole region. We camped on the bank of the river in the immediate vicinity of the mud geyser. This being the first specimen of the true geysers yet seen, it was examined with great curiosity. The central point of interest, however, is the mud volcano, which is broken out from the side of the well-timbered hill. The crater is 25 feet across at the top, gradually sloping inward to the bottom, where it becomes about half this diameter. Its depth is about 30 feet. The deposit is gray mud, nearly pure alumina, and has been thrown up by the action of the volcano at no very distant period. The rim of the crater on the downhill side is some 10 feet in height, and trees 50 feet high and 100 feet distant are loaded with mud thrown from this volcano. The surface of the bottom is in constant state of ebullition, puffing and throwing up masses of boiling mud, and sending forth dense columns of steam several hundred feet above the surrounding forest. This vapor can be seen for many miles in all directions. Some 400 yards from this crater are 3 large hot springs of muddy water, one of which proved to be a geyser, having periods of active eruption about every 6 hours. The phenomena attending these eruptions are as follows. Soon after the violent period passes, the water in the pool gradually subsides through the orifice in the center, the surface falling several feet, the water almost entirely disappearing from sight. It then gradually rises again until the former level is reached, during which occasional ebullitions of greater or lesser magnitude occur. Great agitation then ensues. Pulsations at regular intervals of a few seconds take place, at each of which the water in the crater is elevated higher and higher, until finally, after 10 minutes, a column is forced up to the height of 30 or 40 feet. During this period, waves dash against the sides of the basin, vast clouds of steam escape, and a noise like the rumbling of an earthquake takes place. Suddenly, after about 15 minutes of this commotion, the waves recede, quiet is restored, the waters sink gradually to their lowest limit, from which they soon rise again and repeat the same operation. The Great Geyser Basin. We also quote from Lieutenant Barlow's report the following account of the Great Geysers on Fire Hole River. Entering the basin from the north, and following the banks of the Fire Hole River, whose direction there is about northeast, a series of rapids quite near together is encountered when the river makes a sharp bend to the southwest, at which point is found a small steam jet upon the right. A warm stream comes in from the left, falling over a bank about 10 feet in height. A short distance beyond, a second rapid is found, and then another, about 100 yards farther on, where the gate of the geyser basin is entered. Here, on either side of the river, are 2 lively geysers called the Sentinels. The one on the left is in constant agitation. its waters revolving horizontally with great violence and occasionally spouting upward to the height of 20 feet, the lateral direction being 50 feet. Enormous masses of steam are ejected. The crater of this geyser is 3 feet by 10. The opposite sentinel is not so constantly active and is smaller. The rapids here are 200 yards in length, with a fall of 30 feet. Following the bank of the river, whose general course is from the southeast, though with many windings, 250 yards from the gate, we reach 3 geysers acting in concert. When in full action, the display from these is very fine. The waters spread out in the shape of a fan, in consequence of which they have been named the fan geysers. A plateau opposite the latter contains 15 hot springs of various characteristics. Some are of a deep blue color, from sulfate of copper held in solution, and having fanciful caverns distinctly visible below the surface of the water. The openings at the surface are often beautifully edged with delicately wrought fringes of scalloped rock. One variety deposits a red or brown leathery substance, partially adhering to the sides and bottom of the cavern and waving to and fro in the water like plants. The size of these springs varies from 5 to 40 feet in diameter. 100 yards further up the east side of the stream is found a double geyser, a stream from one of its orifices playing to the height of 80 or 90 feet, emitting large volumes of steam. From the formation of its crater, it was named the Well Geyser. Above is a pine swamp of cold water, opposite which, and just above the plateau previously mentioned, are found some of the most interesting and beautiful geysers of the whole basin. First, we come upon 2 small geysers near a large spring of blue water, while a few yards beyond are seen the walls and arches of the grotto. This is an exceedingly intricate formation, 8 feet in height and 90 in circumference. It is hollowed into fantastic arches with pillars and walls of almost indescribable variety. This geyser plays to the height of 60 feet several times during 24 hours. The water, as it issues from its numerous apertures, has a very striking and picturesque effect. Near the grotto is a large crater elevated 4 feet above the surface of the hill, having a rough-shaped opening measuring 2 by 2.5 feet. 200 yards farther up are 2 very fine geysers, between which and the grotto are 2 boiling springs. Proceeding 150 yards farther and passing 2 hot springs, a remarkable group of geysers is discovered. One of these has a huge crater 5 feet in diameter, shaped something like the base of a horn, one side broken down, the highest point being 15 feet above the mound on which it stands. This proved to be a tremendous geyser, which has been called the Giant. It throws a column of water the size of the opening to the measured altitude of 130 feet and continues the display for an hour and a half. The amount of water discharged was immense, about equal in quantity to that in a river, the volume of which during the eruption was doubled. But one eruption of this geyser was observed. Its periodic turns were not, therefore, determined. Another large crater close by has several orifices, and with 10 small jets surrounding it, formed probably one connected system. The hill, built up by this group, covers an acre of ground and is 30 feet in height. In the report to Congress by the Committee on Public Lands, we learn that the entire area comprised within the limits of the reservation is not susceptible to cultivation with any degree of certainty, and the winters would be too severe for stock raising. Whenever the altitude of the mountain districts exceeds 6,000 feet above tidewater, their settlement becomes problematic unless there are valuable mines to attract people. The entire area within the limits of the proposed reservation is over 6,000 feet in altitude, and the Yellowstone Lake, which occupies an area 15 by 22 miles, or 330 square miles, is 7,457 feet. The ranges of mountains that hem the valley in on every side rise to the height of 10,000 and 12,000 feet and are covered with snow all the year. These mountains are all of volcanic origin, and it is not probable that any mines or minerals of value will ever be found there. During the months of June, July, and August, the climate is pure and most invigorating, with scarcely any rain or storms of any kind, but the thermometer frequently sinks as low as 26 degrees. There is frost every month of the year. These statements make it evident that, in setting apart this area as a great national park and pleasure ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, no injury has been done to other interests. The land did not need to be purchased, but simply withdrawn from settlement, occupancy, or sale, and hence, by timely action, a great public benefit was secured, which in a few years would have been impractical, or at least attainable only with great difficulty. The time is not distant, in the opinion of the Congressional Committee, when this region will be a place of resort for all classes of people from all portions of the globe. The Northern Pacific Railroad, now rapidly advancing towards completion, will render the park easily accessible, and this once accomplished, the marvels of the strange domain will tempt the curious in great numbers to visit it. As a place of resort for invalids, the Yellowstone Valley, on account of its pure and exhilarating atmosphere, is believed to be unexcelled by any portion of the globe. And, if this anticipation prove true, there will be additional reason to be gratified at the wise forethought that secured it for public uses forever. The congressional enactment which creates the park amply provides for its control and management. It shall, says the Act, be under the exclusive control of the Secretary of the Interior, whose duty it shall be, as soon as practicable, to make and publish such rules and regulations as he may deem necessary or proper for the care and management of the same. Such regulations shall provide for a preservation from injury or spoliation of all timber, mineral deposits, natural curiosities, or wonders within said park. The Secretary may, in his discretion, grant leases for building purposes, for terms not exceeding 10 years, of small parcels of ground, at such places in said park as shall require the erection of buildings for the accommodation of visitors. All of the proceeds of said leases to be expended under his direction in the management of the same and the construction of roads and bridle paths therein.